Hey, my friend, on this shocking episode, we talk about how everyday beauty, bath, and lifestyle products contain estrogen-like compounds which are making us fat, sick, and infertile. But don't worry, we also learn what to do about them. Stay tuned. My guest today, Dr. Anthony Jay, is a Ph.D. and research scientist and also the best-selling author of the book Estrogeneration. He's currently at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, researching stem cells, epigenetics, and infrared light. He is also the CEO of the AJ Consulting Company. We're getting into a topic that might shock many of you, so buckle up. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. Today, I have Dr. Jay on. I'm really excited to have him because this man is doing a lot of things. He is a Mayo Clinic scientist, and he's a speaker, he's an outdoorsman, and he's author of the book Estrogeneration, How Estrogenics Are Making Us Fat, Sick, and Infertile. Dr. Jay, welcome to the Anti-Aging Hacks Show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Great show.
So first of all, there's a lot we have to talk about in this episode, but I want to understand how you got into studying estrogens or estrogenics in the first place. How did that happen?
Yeah, it was mostly because when I went to college and during orientation, my very first semester, they talked about birth control being in the water supply, and I had no idea. I'd never even heard of that. Mm-hmm. And honestly, it was just on my radar ever since that point. And then, of course, when I had kids, I really paid attention to it because I started to see the research studies showing all these health ramifications, these problematic issues from these fake estrogen chemicals. And it just kept piling up. People talked about BPA when BPA first came out, or at least when they started marketing it as safe in plastics and they told everybody it doesn't leach. I mean, it's been out since the 20s, right? So in 1920, they were actually researching BPA as a birth control.
Wow.
And this other drug called diethylstilbestrol, there was two compounds, but once they started using it as plastic, they kind of switched gears and, focused on BPA as plastic. But the point is, when I was doing my Ph.D. in biochemistry, it was focused on lipids and fats and hormones. And of course, disrupting hormones was just a natural branch off of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, way to take it off and go super deep into this and really creating this new field that we're learning more about. You've talked about the problems that these fake estrogens have in our bodies or create in our bodies, and you refer to them as the 7 deadly things. Mm-hmm. Can you just briefly describe to the audience what they're doing inside our bodies?
Yeah, exactly. They're just disrupting our natural hormones, our natural sex hormones, and that balance is very delicate. You throw off your testosterone, really a problematic thing. Throw off your natural estrogen, also really problematic. Natural estrogen is really good. It's beneficial. It's protective against Alzheimer's. It's protective for your brain. It's protective for your arteries. Same with natural testosterone. And interestingly enough, too, now we're starting to see a lot more testosterone resistance. So even if your levels look okay on a blood test, it's like insulin resistance where your body's not even responding to it. There's other things like infertility that are, skyrocketing. Setting records every year for people with problems having fertility, not just people having less kids, because that's sometimes a choice, but actually people struggling with fertility. Mm-hmm. Suicides are on the rise. A lot of these chemicals, it's a very similar thing to postpartum depression. They trigger depression. Birth control users, for example, a lot more depression in there, Mm-hmm. But then there's other chemicals too, of course. And it really, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things, breast tissue development in men or breast cancer in women. And so like you said, there's these 7 things that I highlight in my book because they're very common themes amongst these chemicals. But the problem is all these chemicals are additive. There's just so many of them and they're coming at us every single day in many cases. And they're adding on top of each other. It's like, well, if you were just exposed to a little bit of BPA, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. But if you add in some of this birth control in the water I mentioned, and then some of these other chemicals, right, every single day, they start to store up in your fat. They literally cause fat gains. Actually, interestingly enough, too, in relation to aging, they did a study with fruit flies and parabens. And by the way, parabens, which are found in a lot of personal care products, they're one of these artificial estrogen chemicals. Methylparaben, propylparaben, butylparaben, there's a whole class of them. They gave really low dose parabens to fruit flies over the course of their life, which a lot of people use in their personal care products. They're rubbing it on their face, they're putting on those lotions. So imitating that. And fruit flies, of course, very short lifespan, so you can study lifespan. And they found a decreased lifespan substantially just from these paraben exposures. So there's a direct link right there to aging and anti-aging, because not only just do you want to be healthy and optimized, therefore you want to get rid of these chemicals, you also want to live longer, therefore get rid of these chemicals.
Yeah, the goal is to live longer, healthier, and these endocrine disruptors, these chemicals in our supplies and our beauty products all around us really are causing massive disruptions. And we're seeing diseases we've never seen before, or at least the level of these diseases is off the chain, some of which you mentioned, infertility being one of them. How did things get so bad? Now, when I read your book, I'm like, oh my goodness, they're everywhere. Yeah. How did things get so bad so quickly, or were we all sleeping?
It's a good question. I think in America, it's because our politicians are really run by money, run by these, basically it's always money behind the scenes moving the politics. Because if you look at Europe, and I do that, and I think it's chapter 2 or 3 in the book, I just do a head-to-head comparison and say, look, here's the legal status of parabens in the US. And by the way, in China, they have more restrictions on parabens than we have in the US. But certainly in Europe, I mean, it's like a night and day difference. And then you look at atrazine, which is a herbicide. It's the number 2 used herbicide in North America, the second most used. And by the way, in Europe, totally illegal. They don't allow any of it. Wow. And on and on. You go down the list and you just do a head-to-head against Europe. And it's very stark, very obvious that, the laws in America are influenced by the money, because there's big money behind some of these things. And that's probably the root cause of the issue, I think.
And it's really interesting because you talk about glyphosate, right? That's gotten a lot of press lately, negative press. So consumers are like, no glyphosate, but they don't know what's behind it. Like they say no BPA. They don't know what's behind BPA, what is being used instead of BPA, BPS, for example. So there's bad things all around us, but consumers get fixated on 1 or 2 or 3 because they're like, well, this is bad. But they don't know that the substitutes are also as bad.
Exactly. And I feel like nobody was talking about that when I was writing my book. I feel like I brought that completely to light, because the idea of BPA free, as unsafe wasn't even a thing. At the time I was writing my book, people just assumed, well, if it's BPA free, it's estrogen free. But exactly like you said, instead of bisphenol A, they were switching it to bisphenol S, which is, and they've done studies, it's exactly as estrogenic, if not more estrogenic than BPA. And then sometimes they use bisphenol F, like the letter F, and if you make that illegal, they can change it to AF, or they can literally just go through the whole alphabet. These chemists are kind of sneaky. It's not honest, it's not ethical, but they do it because, again, there's money, there's a ton of money behind this. And if you don't do it, if I don't do it, somebody else will pay somebody else to do it. Mm-hmm. So it's really a shell game. And even with the bisphenols, you get away from those, people start putting phthalates in the plastic. Yeah. Phthalates are super problematic, arguably worse than BPAs, bisphenols, but it's harder to say because the research hasn't been as thorough with the phthalates in terms of the levels. They don't measure it down to the same levels they do with BPA, because again, we've been studying BPA since the 20s. I mean, we know that it acts like a birth control. So they've been looking at it in the nanogram per liter levels, which is the levels that our hormones are at in our body. Whereas phthalates, they're not even close to that. They're like 1,000 times higher, in terms of their detection limits on most of these third-party testing companies. Mm-hmm. So not even looking for it at the low levels, but when they finally do in research studies, they find all kinds of problems with phthalates. So again, plastics, really questionable. And just on a practical level, you don't want to be storing your liquids in plastics. You don't want to be heating things up in plastics. And oils too, really bad to be storing oils in plastics. I feel like those are the 3 things: liquids, long time, like duration, and then how oily the substance is. That's how much transfer you're going to get.
Mm-hmm. I have a few more questions on that. But before we get in, Dr. Jay, first of all, we need smart people like you to be exposing what's happening in this industry and how these chemists are getting away with, I wouldn't call murder, but unethical practices. The other point I wanted to say is, let's talk about how these estrogenics get into our bodies and how they kind of disrupt the hormone signaling, right? I think you've mentioned that testosterone is now being lower, but how are they competing with testosterone or estrogen inside our bodies?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. Like again, with the politics, we've got Greta Thunberg or whatever her name is on these health committees, basically these making global, policy decisions.
Right.
But yeah, and I mean, these things get into our bodies just through our diet, through our skin, through our water, but into the cells. It's really interesting because sex hormones, they can actually go into the cell. They physically diffuse into cells, whereas most hormones don't actually do that. Most hormones stick to the outside surface of a cell, and that kind of flips a switch and triggers something to happen inside the cell. While sex hormones are different, testosterone, DHEA, pregnenolone, progesterone, they go through the cell membrane. They go right into the cell. So you can imagine there's more potential for disruption there when you're doing that. And not only that, the sex hormones, a lot of people don't realize, the nucleus where the DNA is actually has its own cell membrane. So our cells have a membrane, a bilayer. There's, it's like a pillowcase. The DNA has its own pillowcase, and it's very rigid. It's very stringent. It doesn't just let anything come in there because you want to protect your DNA. And what's interesting about sex hormones, they go into that nuclear membrane. They go into the DNA, into that DNA compartment. And therefore, they can screw with your epigenetics, the marks on top of your DNA, which for sex hormones, again, it's a delicate balance. It's a good thing. You want that manipulation of your epigenetics. With artificial estrogens, you definitely don't want that manipulation. And you see it, right? You see it in the transgenerational studies. That's where it's been a really blockbuster thing. And that's what my book was all about, was exposing the multi-generational impacts. And that's why it's called Estrogeneration, because the future generations are being affected. Not only us, it is definitely a generational exposure, but multiple generations. And so, you see it when they study fertility. You see declines in fertility in animal models with future generations. All you do is expose the mother to some of these chemicals at low doses, by the way, and you see like the next generation has less fertility, the next generation has less fertility, etc. It's crazy.
Wow.
And so you can't explain that with just genetics.
So when the mother is maybe engaging in the acts that's going to produce the baby, and they have these chemicals inside of their bodies, the epigenetics are turned on in such a way that the baby, now in this case, is also predisposed to being infertile or not being as healthy as a normal baby would. And therefore that just kind of keeps going on, propagating through the species.
You got it. Yeah. Yeah. And the blockbuster study was by a guy named Michael Skinner. I think it was about 2010. His paper was the most cited scientific research paper for 5 straight years. Wow. I mean, gigantic. And of course he did a TED talk on this, but not a lot of people watched it, but like it was a great study. He literally grows about 3,000 to 5,000 mice at any given time. He came here to Mayo Clinic and gave a talk. I had lunch with him, talked to him for about an hour by my one-on-one. And like I said, he's really on the front lines of this, and you see a lot of health issues. But what was groundbreaking about his study was it was 4 generations. Because previous to that, people would say, well, yeah, the mother is exposed and the fetus is inside the mother, so that's a second generation being exposed. But then the fetus already has, stem cells that have egg and sperm cells, so that's 3 generations. You can kind of make an argument that 3 generations are being exposed in one shot. Mm-hmm. Wow. But you can't make an argument that 4 generations are being exposed. There's physically no way for that to happen. So when you start seeing, these health dysfunctions increase right out to the 4th, 5th generation, wow, that's epigenetics. And
that's something you're looking into, which I have some questions around that as well. Let's talk about the lowering of testosterone in men. Like, how often are you seeing this, and how much of this is related to these estrogens that we're taking in through the environment?
Yeah, it's a huge problem in our culture. I mean, they used to call it male feminization in scientific studies, like with atrazine and things. They would just straight up call it feminization of males. I mean, it's less testosterone, that's more feminine. Right. And not only that, you see other things like reduced anogenital distance and things like that, now they just kind of try and politicize it and say it's gonadal deformations, and they use these weird terms instead of saying feminization. But the average in the 1980s of total male testosterone was about 500, according to a Massachusetts aging study. In the 80s, it was 500. In the 90s, it was about 400. In the 2000s, it was down to 300. And right now we're seeing people coming all the time around 250. In fact, they've been lowering the normal range ever since because it's so common. They're doing that with puberty with girls too, that puberty age is getting so low. They're writing medical journal articles right now saying we should lower the normal range for puberty because we got these 9-year-old girls coming in all the time.
My goodness.
And it's not healthy. It's not really normal, but they're trying to make it seem normal because it's so common. It's just like like everybody's basically their blood sugar's super high. So they're trying to make it normal to have high blood sugar. This doesn't mean it's good for you. It just means everybody around you is having that same problem. It's still a problem.
Yeah. On the testosterone readings themselves, I wish those ranges would be by decade of life or something, because they're anywhere from 200 to 1100, if I remember correctly. And so
exactly,
it's really hard to say, a 22-year-old male versus a 70-year-old male, what the actual range should be. So I find that that's problematic in itself. But to your point, they're lowering across the board. And I have talked to many men that have sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction in their 30s, and they're taking all kinds of pills to help with that problem. Not saying that's purely a testosterone issue, but it's all leading down that path of sexual dysfunction, infertility, and all of this. Now, in terms of women, Dr. J, there's more breast cancer, right? The rates are going up. How is that related? Isn't estrogen helpful for a woman?
Yeah, it's up about 250% since 1980 globally, breast cancer is. And it's because of these estrogens, they trick you. Like for example, when women are pregnant, of course they get increased breast tissue development as a response to increasing estrogen. Their estrogen shoots way up when women are pregnant. So there's physiological changes. But when you deceive your system into thinking your estrogen is going way up, and you're a man, you're not even supposed to mimic pregnancy in a man. But even for women, of course, like with all these fake estrogens, you're basically tricking your body into thinking it's pregnant, but it's not really. And it kind of knows that that's not the case, but it's being goofed up. It's being manipulated. It's problematic. And then you get this abnormal breast tissue development turns cancerous, right? I mean, that's kind of the mechanism. It's the breast cancers are generally estrogen alpha receptor positive. And that alpha receptor, there's two estrogen receptors. One's called estrogen receptor beta, alpha and beta, right? And alpha is not really supposed to be activated except for basically fetal development, sexual development, whereas beta is supposed to be activated. It's a little bit technical, and I didn't get into this in my book because I wanted to keep it simple, but I feel like if people really want to get into the weeds, there's a little bit of information there. I mean, look into the alpha versus the beta receptor. The beta is generally protective against breast cancer. The alpha is generally causing breast cancer. And of course, these fake estrogens trigger that alpha receptor.
I gotcha. And of course, we would be doing people a disservice if we didn't talk about the worst offenders in this Estrogenics family, if you will. You've listed the top 10 in your book. And I understand that people's eyes might glaze if they actually hear the technical terms that we have to use. But can you just talk about a few of them that are bad and tell us why they're bad?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we talked about the plastics as a category, BPA, parabens, phthalates. And parabens and phthalates are both in personal care products too. Personal care products are a huge source. I mean, people have got to overhaul their personal care products. If they're just getting the cheap ones from Walmart or whatever, they're full of these estrogen chemicals. And oftentimes it's just in the word fragrance on the label. They don't even have to legally put them on the label.
Yeah.
If you get,
I heard that these companies can put 4,000 chemicals under this fragrance name. How is that even allowed?
Yeah, well, it's politics and money.
Jeez.
Yeah, exactly. So, and on the laundry detergent, they don't have to put anything on the label, right? It's really hard to get a good laundry detergent because you can't even see the labels, and you have to kind of find a company that you trust, or go fragrance free if you're in doubt, because fragrance free is at least a better option, right? But yeah, and then of course, some of the food ones include atrazine, which is a herbicide, glyphosate, which is becoming more and more apparent as an estrogen, particularly when it interacts with soy. So then you get the plant estrogens like soy and flax. Then the plants, by the way, are very few are estrogenic. Very few act like estrogen. They did a study with over 100 foods, and everything was under 1,000 units of estrogen except soy and flax. And soy and flax were over 100,000 units of estrogen. Wow. So it's like a night and day difference. And everybody, like, it's funny because everybody said, like, a lot of people argue with me about this, like, oh, soy estrogen's not bad, you know. And it's like, well, you can argue that if you want. I disagree, and I can explain why. It takes a long time. It's nuanced. You have to go through a lot of studies and kind of sift through a lot of bias and garbage. But the point that's really important is that all the scientists agree that soy acts like estrogen. Like, that's not disagreed upon. Okay. Whether it's healthy estrogen or whether it's bad estrogen is the debate sometimes. But at least, again, there's no disagreement that it acts like estrogen. And just on the plants too, there's two other ones that are interesting, and that is cannabis smoke. When people are literally lighting it up, it's not the vaping for some reason, it's not the THC, it's just the lighting it up. That acts like estrogen. And then the lavender essential oil also acts like estrogen. Wow. So those are the plant estrogens.
Okay, so those are some big ones. Do you have some more you're going to talk about? Because I have some questions on those.
No, I mean, I red, like artificial red dye, I would suggest people avoid. That's another one. But yeah, I think that's the main ones. And certainly there's some mold estrogens, some sunscreen estrogens. Like, people should never get conventional sunscreen or even shampoos and things that have the sunscreen, or these, again, the laundry detergents. They put these photo bleaching chemicals to protect your clothing and they brag about it, but those are all sunscreen estrogen chemicals. Get the sunscreen with zinc. I feel like that's a pretty good summary of the list. Yeah. Okay.
So in terms of sunscreen, let's start there. You recommend a mineral sunscreen with zinc.
Exactly.
And is there, like, obviously they have 20 other ingredients. How would people know that zinc plus only 2 or 3 are the best and nothing else? Or do you have brands that you recommend?
Yeah, I do, of course, because I've tested like 8 or 10 brands that are good ingredients, but I'm super fair skinned and I get burned with a lot of them. They'll have 20% zinc and just coconut oil or whatever. I'll get fried, but then I'll test a different brand, 20% zinc, coconut oil, couple of good ingredients, and I'll be fine. So I tested a bunch, and some of them make you super white. You rub them on and they look like a ghost. And then some of them, it goes into your skin pretty nicely. Right. So there's different, but at the end of the day, I feel like if it's got 20% zinc and you can read all the rest of the ingredients on the label, it's probably excellent. And it works for you. That's the most important thing in that regard. But they did a study after I published my book on sunscreen. And, you know, and first of all, the government's safety limits for these estrogens are ridiculous. Like, they're way too high. You know, they should be lowered, you know. But that being said, they did a study with sunscreen, one application of conventional sunscreen, and it's got this chemical called oxybenzone that acts like estrogen. One application, Walmart sunscreen, 7 days later, people's blood level were still above the government's own recommended safety limit for oxybenzone.
Yikes.
And it's not in my book, unfortunately, because the study was done after I wrote my book. And when I was writing my book, everybody was saying, no, that's not really the case. It's like not really problematic. And you know, I felt like the writing was on the wall enough for me to include all the information about sunscreen chemicals in my book. But now it's indisputable. I mean, these chemicals, you definitely don't want to be putting them on your kids. Their hormones are super sensitive. You definitely don't want to be putting them on your skin through your lotion every day. You don't want to be using straight up sunscreen because the doses are outrageous. 7 days later, and so they've been making sunscreens illegal in a lot of places. Hawaii, oxybenzone sunscreen is illegal. You have to use zinc. There's like 4 or 5 other countries that have pledged to make it illegal by next year. So things are moving.
Awesome. That's great to hear. Okay, so sunscreen, check out your recommendations. And obviously most people love a sunscreen that's thin, that gets applied to your face and gets absorbed. It doesn't leave a big old wide residue. Right. So you're saying just play with a couple and see what you like best.
And of course, I have a page on my website. You mentioned it off air. We were talking about it. AJConsultingCompany.com/whatiuse, all one word. I list the 2 sunscreens or 2 or 3 or whatever that I found that I like really, I use. I don't have any affiliation with the companies or anything like that on any of those products. I've just tested a lot of shit and I put it out there because I feel like, well, I've done a lot of research. I spent a ton of money on a lot of this stuff. Like the deodorants, I've bought like 20 different brands of deodorants, and try them all. I'll do one under one arm or one under the other arm. Because a lot of these natural ones, they don't work, you know?
Yeah.
And everybody's a little different. So I can't say, well, if it works for me, it's going to work for you, but at least it works for me. Start there.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think I've got a pretty optimized medicine cabinet and beauty products, but I was geeking out on your page actually. And I'm like, oh, I got to replace my detergent. I got to do this. I got to do that. So the next time I buy anything, I'm going to go reference your page. So thank you for putting that up, by the way. Sure. Let's circle back on a couple other things you said. One was Lavender Essential Oil, which a lot of people are using. They're growing in popularity. I think women especially love some of the natural ways of living, and essential oils are increasing in consumption. You're saying that lavender, when you put it on the skin or when you breathe it in, it's estrogenic and therefore should be avoided or limited.
Correct. Yeah. And the New England Journal of Medicine came out with a study showing that. And it was instigated because there was children, like 1-year-old children, they started to go into puberty, like the breast development, the whole thing. And there's quite a lot of them. And then they were asking them, well, what kind of personal care products are you using? What are you feeding them? What are you doing? And all of them had the one pattern that they could find with all of them was that they were using lavender essential oil products. And they got rid of those products and they all reversed their puberty, their pre-pubertal, anyway, they reversed that issue. So then that's telling, right? Like that's information, that's interesting. But they went further and they tested the lavender essential oil on the estrogen receptor and found it activates the estrogen receptor as much as estradiol. Like it's very powerful from a biochemist perspective, like myself. And the funny thing is, when I give talks, and of course I do this all the time, like a month ago, I gave a talk for 300 medical doctors in Utah for CME credits, things like that. I actually gave a 3-hour talk for that one. But, everybody comes up after my talk and says, well, my essential oil comes from this company, so it's better and this and that. And it's like, well, have you ever done the study? The research they've done have been on multiple different brands of essential oil for lavender. This isn't essential oils in general. This is just lavender. And by the way, lavender is anti-inflammatory, so it has a benefit, right? That's well documented. But I don't think it's worth the risk because it's got this endocrine disrupting potential, and along with all the other endocrine disruptors in our environment, it's just not worth it. I mean, I use essential oils. I'll make soda with that soda stream machine, the bubbler, put CO2 into the water. I put like some tangerine essential oil in there, a little bit of stevia, and I'm good to go, right? I mean, I'm personally use this stuff, so it's not like I'm against essential oils, but that particular one I am against.
Okay, so I am going to stop using it because that is part of my sleep architecture. I rub it under my nose before I go to bed. It calms me down and I doze off pretty quickly, but I'm going to have to find another relaxant for my mind that's not lavender. So if you're listening, reconsider your use of lavender essential oil. The other thing you mentioned was marijuana. If I believe you said if you're smoking it, if you're lighting it up, stay away from that. But vaping's okay and THC is okay.
Exactly, and once in a while is okay in general, but yeah, it's the chronic use. I mean, all I can say is the studies on the smoke have found it to be estrogenic and endocrine disrupting, and then they followed that up with just looking at all the individual molecules like THC and whatnot, and they don't find those to be estrogenic. So I think that's why you see decreased fertility in chronic, cannabis users and things like that. Like you see a lot of these health issues that you would expect to see if it's acting like estrogen. But again, they've done the direct studies, so that's pretty powerful.
I know that every brand in the world right now is creating some kind of CBD product, either to apply topically or to ingest for sleeping, lots of it. So it's very interesting in terms of, consumer demand and where this is going, but good to know that. In terms of, putting it on your skin or ingesting it, you haven't seen any?
Should be good.
Okay, we should be good.
Should be good.
Okay, got it. Let's talk about birth control, for example. There's birth controls that have androgens, they have estrogens. There's natural birth controls, there's oral, there's devices you can insert. How are these birth control pills, for example, that you mentioned, are they estrogenic, and what effects are they having on women?
Yeah, not all of them are estrogenic, but most of them are. And the main ingredient I look for is 17-alpha ethinyl estradiol. Sometimes they just call it EE2. I mean, it's clearly an estrogenic. It's designed to be an artificial estrogen. It's designed to stay in your body longer because your body doesn't break it down. It's just like these steroids, right? Like a lot of the development around steroids, it's obviously mimicking testosterone, but it's not testosterone. It's mimicking, and it's specifically manipulated in a way to make sure your liver doesn't break it down, to make sure your liver can't break it down. That's part of the problem, is then the users of those steroids, or in this case, the birth control, they pee it out, right? They pee quite a lot of it out. And our water filtration, our municipal systems are really good at getting rid of bacteria, really good at getting viruses out, all that, and killing all that stuff, but they don't filter out these hormones. And that's the big concern is, if you want to take this stuff, whatever, like, recognize there's a lot of risks, and you should look at the risks, just like vaccines and things. You'd be surprised how long the list of potential adverse reactions there are, but at least, recognize the risks and take those on if you want. But the problem is, if you don't know you're getting it, like you're drinking it every day in your water supply, and most people are, if they're in big cities, it's surprisingly high in the water supply. And so filter it, and it's easy. The solution is just to use activated charcoal. Okay. Any filter with activated.
Yeah, that's pretty inexpensive from what I know. Right? Yep. You don't have to go the reverse osmosis route yet, which you might consider anyway, but at least from where estrogens are considered, or considering those, you could just get an activated charcoal filter, and that'll take care of that problem.
Exactly. And almost all of them have activated charcoal. Sometimes they call it carbon, which isn't really true, but that's what they mean when they say it's got carbon in it or something. And it's funny, every once in a while I bump into a filter that doesn't have activated charcoal, and it just makes me shake my head, like, why didn't they put it in there? Why isn't that a main component of the filter? But just double check if you've got one, make sure it's got that. Okay.
Let me ask you one more women's question. This is, yes, they're going into puberty sooner. On the other end of the spectrum, I'm hearing, anecdotal, I don't know the data, that women are having menopause earlier and earlier. And they're well in their 40s now. Some are even having in their late 30s, where in the past it used to be around the 50 year or more so. Have you read any reports or any data on how estrogens may be influencing menopause?
It's a really good point. I'm sure it's related, but I don't know. And it kind of ties back to that testosterone. I know more about testosterone because I'm more interested in it personally, but I'd be super curious if any of your listeners have a study or something to email me with that regarding menopause. But I was going to mention before, everybody's testosterone is declining, as I mentioned. What's interesting is with age, our total testosterone doesn't decline. It's actually become like almost dogmatic. People say, oh, I've got the testosterone of an 8-year-old. Well, your testosterone doesn't decline with age. People say that, and you hear it all the time. Yeah, and I've got studies to prove it. They in the 80s, they used to have studies with small numbers of people that indicated it was declining. But they've done a study with like over 100,000 people, I think it is. And of course, I have those studies. I can email you that to you. But, from age 30 all the way up to age 80, there's no decline with age. The problem is our whole culture has been declining, so that's been screwing it up, right?
Yes. So let me ask you this question then regarding testosterone. Obviously, read your book. Get Dr. J's book if you're interested in improving testosterone. Knock out all of these things. I don't know if I can say knock out, but diminish estrogens, phytoestrogens, all of these as much as possible. Are there additional tips in your back pocket that you might offer to the male listeners, Dr. J?
Male listeners? Yeah, I mean, certainly using a sauna is one of my favorite. I mean, male or female, because they've done studies on BPA, on phthalates, on a lot of these estrogens. They call them BUS studies, blood, urine, sweat. Yeah. And you actually sweat out more estrogens than you pee out.
Is that
shocking.
Right?
Like you barely urinate any of them out, but you sweat a ton of them out. So,
awesome.
And you don't have to use a sauna for that. Like now with COVID, it's almost possible to get a sauna, but you can just sweat, like just work out and intentionally make sure that you sweat for 10 minutes while you're working out. That's a good step in the right direction too.
Okay. Great. I was for the first time in over a year, I had pho, Vietnamese soup bowl, and we got it delivered, of course, at our place. And so when the food came, it was the hot, steaming hot broth in a plastic container, and I was like, "Oh, what am I doing? This is the worst," because hot liquids and plastics are bad. Even in normal temperature, I think they're not great, but hot is even worse. And so in terms of, I know you mentioned, don't have oils within plastic containers. In your book, you talk about coffee containers that are plastic that may also leach off some of the estrogens. What in a normal kitchen, what could we avoid? What should we prefer when it comes to these things?
Yeah, I use silicone. I think silicone's excellent for spatulas and things like that. And then I just get glass Tupperware and things. And I know it's kind of expensive, that initial investment, but you can just slowly replace it over time if you have to. It's worth doing. But I think the Tupperware, the food storage is the biggest thing. But people also don't realize a lot of times those aluminum cans have plastic linings. It's not aluminum, it's actually plastic with aluminum on the outside. So
like tuna?
Like soda. Yeah, exactly. Even some of the tuna and some of those cans, although a lot of those companies like from Trader Joe's and whatnot, they've made pledges to avoid estrogens after I wrote my book, of course. So thankfully that's on their radar. But there's obviously a lot of companies that haven't done that. So it's kind of a crapshoot sometimes. So I'm careful with doing a lot of canned foods a lot of the time. And exceptions are always fine, but yeah, it's when people are doing stuff consistently all the time. Yeah, I think there's a couple major ones, right? Get the big ones.
Yeah, obviously start with the big ones. So try to limit the use of plastics, favor glass, and what about stainless steel?
Stainless, exactly.
Okay, stainless steel. Okay, that's a good one too. And you can reuse these. You're saving the environment more as well. So we've talked a lot about the foods. We've talked about the oils. I think the one other thing you mentioned is maybe not even, or consider reducing your consumption of flaxseed, because that's got a lot of estrogens in it. And I know that every health expert is like flaxseed oil, or have flaxseed in your smoothies, which I was putting, honestly. So I'm gonna cut those down as well.
Well, yeah, and by the way, flax, of course, has omega-3s, which are healthy, and it's got CBD, which is healthy. It's kind of like lavender. There are health benefits, so you can find them in the studies, and it is interesting. But because of the estrogen, I don't think it's worth those. You can get CBD from hemp. You can get omega-3 from fish, so you don't have to go with flax. So that's my approach on those.
Gotcha. Okay, and then your perspective on grains and what is it, corn?
Yeah, corn, get organic. If you're going to do grains, get them organic. I tend to shy away from grains, but some people have good genetics and they can handle them. But yeah, generally, grains are almost pretty much the first thing that people should cut out of their diet if they're trying to be healthy across the board and trying to live a long time, for a number of reasons. We could talk all day on the grains. I mean, there's a lot of mold in the grains. There's a lot of pesticides and herbicides and anti-fungicides and all kinds of garbage. And then now with the GMO stuff, which of course is a whole can of worms, but some of that stuff is potentially iffy. And again, it's debatable, it's debated, but I'm happy to engage in that debate because, it's, as long as I'm not being censored, I feel like the information should be getting out there that those, even some of the GMO toxins that they're developing right into the grains are really problematic. So yeah, if you're going to do grains, like say corn, white rice is generally the best. And white is better than brown because brown has the husks, and the husks can actually be tough on your gut lining. So, I like that as a carb source if you need a carb source.
Right. I also hear that brown rice has much more arsenic than white rice. So it could be dangerous that way. In Los Angeles, where I live, the website, EWG website, shows you, contaminants in your water. And I think the arsenic is 520 times more than the legal or the recommended limits, I should say.
Yeah.
It's crazy what's going on.
Yeah.
So Dr. Jay, how can people, I know that you work with people, how can people find you and work with you regarding consultations and one-on-one, and what does your service look like for individuals?
Yeah, well, people need to do their 23andMe in order to consult with me. I don't even take consults until we do a genetic consult. So my main focus with my consulting company, which I have, it's called AJ Consulting Company, is DNA consults. So I look at people's genetics, and there's a lot of things you can look at. Like I do the brain genes. I look at brain optimization. I do diet optimization, detox, vitamins, hormones. And then I do exercise and training, and I do sleep genes. So some people are super blue light sensitive, it screws with their sleep. Some people aren't, you know what I mean? Like there's so many different things. Some people have a really high risk for Alzheimer's with heavy metals like arsenic, like you're talking about. Some people don't. And so there's all this different, variation. Some people handle estrogens pretty damn good. Some people are terrible in their ability to clear estrogens. And so these things have a much greater impact. Some people have great testosterone genes. Some people have terrible testosterone genes. And it's good to know those genes before you start to, think about how to change your lifestyle, because it's more precise. It's not just guessing, because you can spend years just guessing on supplements and spending hundreds of extra dollars on trying everything under the sun, which again, I've done. Yeah. But it's more of a hobby for me. And so that's what I do. I do genetic consults based on 23andMe data or ancestry. And
is that a one-time consult? Is it a series of consults?
No, it's almost always one time. Like I would say 99% of people, it's just one time, and that's all I'm interested. But if every once in a while somebody has like additional follow-up questions, they want to get super in depth, and I'm happy to entertain that. But usually, the best bang for your buck is to just do that, because your DNA never changes, right? Yeah. I don't consider myself like a training coach where I follow up on people and really like work with like how many reps are you doing, and like how is your form on your deadlift and things. I feel like there's a lot of good people out there doing that, and not a lot of people doing the genetic consult the way I do it, where I sit down and go through it, make it super simple, give people like really tight lists of priority supplements and this and that. So that's great. That's what I focus on.
I think what you're doing is cool, because yes, 23andMe give you vague recommendations, and then there's other services that you can export your data into, and then they'll give you a little bit deeper, but you've got to do a lot of work. You've got to do a lot of lead work. You've got to kind of research some of this. There's maybe 20 studies or 20 reports they'll give you. And so you've got to read through those and kind of compile your own program. Whereas with you, I think you will do the work for them, and you'll say, here's the 5 or 10 things you should be doing to optimize across all these areas.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, yeah. That's great. And I know that you're also interested in epigenetics, which is, how the environment's shaping us, or the expression of our genes. Where is that research right now? What are you up to, and where do you see this going in the future?
Yeah, I mean, me personally, I'm interested in infrared light and how that influences our epigenetics and things like that. I do full messenger RNA sequencing and really cutting edge things, but it's not really ready for the public or for personal use. Of course, it's all at the research level, and it's a really huge exploding field, and so it's really a valuable field. And a lot of scientists kind of downplay genetics because epigenetics is so powerful and interesting. It's not really true. I think they're both super impactful and super valuable. And so again, I'm interested in it, of course, because it's got that generational aspect, and because epigenetics, you can rewrite those epigenetics. And by the way, one of the most powerful ways to rewrite, when you get them all screwed up from these estrogens, like birth controls and all these other kinds of things, you're struggling with fertility. A lot of times the natural hormones are the best ones, like testosterone for men that are low on testosterone. You bump that up, and it rewrites a lot of those bad epigenetic marks. It basically like erases the crappy ones and rewrites in the good ones. So that's probably one of the most powerful things you can do in terms of rewriting your epigenetics right now, get those sex hormones optimized.
That's cool. So where can people find you online, Dr. J?
Yeah, just AJConsultingCompany.com. That's my preferred source. Terrible website name, but I've had it since 2010. So AJConsultingCompany.com. You got to spell all that out.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the show notes as well, so people can just click on it. So be sure to check out Dr. J and look up his website. Definitely read the book. And if you're interested in the DNA analysis and recommendations by an expert, then go and reach out to him at ajconsultingcompany.com. Dr. J, thank you so much for coming on the Anti-Aging Hacks Show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Faraz.